This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. The Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, published by the European Union in December, mark a big shift in policy towards the proactive regulation of social media companies, requiring more effective action against harmful content, preventing anti-competitive business practices, and auditing the tech giants on their performance. I'm Damian, and in this podcast I'll be discussing these initiatives with Marietje Schaake, the International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center, who previously served between 2009 and 2019 as a member of the European Parliament for the Netherlands, and Felix, who has worked for the European Union's External Action Service, investigating the effects of harmful disinformation on social media. We'll also be joined as well by our resident disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. Marietje Schaake, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast. And before we start our conversation, I wonder if you could just tell our listeners where you are, because we've had people in all sorts of locations, including, I think, on the last podcast, the guest was on a hotel balcony in Bangalore. But where are you at the moment?
Well, not quite as exotic, but I'm in a little cabin as far removed from people as possible, hiking in the northeast of the Netherlands for a couple of days.
Well, that sounds, with everything else going on, that sounds like a good place to be. But if we can sort of drag you back to the ordinary world, on this podcast we've had quite a lot of discussions around tech regulation, both in terms of moderating content, but also in terms of competition policy as well. And before Christmas in the UK, the government published the online harms response to the online harms white paper, and we're expecting a government bill on that in the new year. And that really focuses on content moderation online. But the publication of the Digital Services Act in Europe before Christmas as well is a truly significant piece of legislation that could shape policy across to the whole of the EU. And it seems similar in many respects, about establishing the principles that the tech companies have some responsibility for how their platforms are used by their users.
No, absolutely. And it's so remarkable how much of a change and tipping point 2020 has represented in the way in which the platform companies have themselves taken on more moderating roles when it came to COVID disinformation, election disinformation. And I think that the tipping point should really continue and lead to clarity on who is responsible for mitigating which harms. And, right as we speak at the start of the new year, and I wish everyone a great, hopeful, healthy 2021, we see the outcomes of disinformation really still playing out in the most dramatic ways in the United States, with a president who is using rumors, even quoting rumors, to challenge the very outcome of democratic elections. And so what I think is really important to recognize first and foremost, that these are not just harms that exist in the form of information and rumors that people may believe online, like the earth is flat or alternative medicine, but that the harms truly play out in the real world, with people mistrusting democracy, willing to use violence, not willing to use a vaccine for this global pandemic, which can cost lives and really erode the very fabric of our open liberal democracies. And so the urgency to do more on the part of regulators, I think, has become very, very clear, not to leave this to self-regulatory efforts by platforms. And so this Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act that were presented in tandem in the EU right before Christmas are seeking to do that, to spell out more clearly, who has which responsibilities, large companies being prevented from playing these gatekeeper roles and pushing out their competitors, buying out their competitors, and essentially abusing their power. So it spells out, how with great power should come greater responsibility, and where the limits of their ability to use and abuse market power lie.
Absolutely, and I think it's so good to see that. Certainly, I think the thinking in the UK and in Europe is actually very, very similar on this, and increasingly the debate in the US as well seems to be moving away from the idea of the tech companies merely being neutral platforms with no responsibility for their content. And I certainly think the antitrust cases in America against Google and Facebook show a big shift there in terms of addressing market power and domination. But going back to the Digital Services Act and the idea of content moderation responsibilities for the big tech companies, I mean, where do you see the balance here between simply removing harmful content, which is very important, versus not amplifying that content, which in some ways is where the greatest harm is caused, when bad content is not just on the platform, but it's being amplified by the platform's own algorithms?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is remarkable to see how both the UK and Europe are moving along, hopefully as closely connected as possible. And indeed, a big shift in the United States, where these big tech companies were initially seen as champions and now seen as really responsible for unraveling the very fabric of American democracy as well. I think some of the devil will be in the detail of who will be deemed responsible at the end of this legislative process around the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, in terms of, deciding who should take content down or who should mark it as harmful or as illegal, and how the Digital Services Act also operates in parallel with the European Democracy Action Plan, with the General Data Protection Regulation. The challenge of these pieces of the legislative puzzle is how they will interact with each other. And I think the good news is that there is an articulation of what is expected of tech platforms. What is challenging, I think, is that there's still this risk of responsibilities being outsourced to the very companies that are responsible for the harms in the first place. And I would like to see much more leadership and also legitimate initiative on the part of democratic governments, independent regulators, where the democratic mandate should really come first, and the accountability also in terms of who decides where limits of speech, a very essential part of our free societies, should lie. And I think too much responsibility is still in the hands of the big tech platforms. And I hope that will change with the eventual outcome of the Digital Services Act, because I'm sure that these big tech platforms will lobby like they never have before.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. The question, I think, is really important here, that the role of a regulator for social media platforms shouldn't be just to make sure that they enforce their own platform policies. Although if they did just that, the world would certainly be a better place. But that actually the democratic parliament should have the right to insist on certain standards and make sure that they're being met, and not just leave it to the tech companies to define that for themselves. But the key thing here is that we have oversight and regulatory bodies that will have the power to set those standards and also to enforce them and audit companies when they fail. And unless we've got regulators with those sorts of auditing powers, then there's a danger that the companies largely self-police based on self-declared information about what they're doing without the ability to check it. And it's a question I've asked the UK government, but I was interested to know in Europe how you think people will go about approaching that issue as well.
I think you're right that it's an unprecedented situation where these companies are indeed drafting their own rules, regulating and enforcing their own rules, and then declaring the process to have been an enormous success in their own transparency reporting. Just imagine that kind of process with any other industry, car fabricators or car factories saying that they have the safest and the best cars, and no need to independently verify. Pharma companies saying that the vaccines that are now being produced for fighting COVID are A-OK. I mean, this whole idea of so much power without independent oversight and independent research is just something that has to be disrupted, so to say. And in that sense, I think the transparency aspects of the Digital Services Act are a reason for hope. I'm sure that my colleagues at Stanford will be very happy to have more of an ability to actually look under the hood of these big tech platforms. But the idea of who should regulate in the EU is not as clearly spelled out as you have in the UK Online Harms Act, which I'm really curious to see how it will play out, to have a specific regulator for this aspect of the legislation, because some parts of what needs to be enforced and looked into may already be in the mandates of existing regulators like antitrust or data protection regulators or non-discrimination agencies or media regulators. And here again, I hope that the different aspects of where independent oversight should come from will come together in a coherent way. So, it might also be useful to hear what you expect of this independent regulator in the UK and how it sits within a broader landscape of regulatory oversight bodies.
It's a good question, and one that I've certainly been involved in discussing with colleagues in the UK Parliament. And there was a question, I think, at the start of this process of should we create like a super regulator, like an internet regulator, which would bring together work done by the Information Commissioner on data privacy, content moderation, and also competition law. Working, maybe pulling in resources from the Competition and Markets Authority. My view on that is, I think the internet, because the internet isn't a discrete thing, it's increasingly involved in everything, that it's difficult to create one regulator that says, well, that's the internet regulator. Because, and it might be better instead to have a series of bodies that have specialisms, but which work closely together. So I think it was probably the right step for us to turn to our media regulator, Ofcom, and say, well, you regulate broadcast content and media. Therefore, so you're already used to making judgments and decisions on taste and decency and balance and fairness, and making subjective judgments based on that. And therefore, you could be well equipped to do the same for online and social media. And in some ways, it would seem very odd if you take as consumers increasingly regard broadcast television as an online product, and young adults will regard YouTube as being television just as much as they would regard the BBC as being television, then it would be odd to have a traditional media regulator that does the traditional broadcasters, and then another regulator that does the new players online. So having one body that is a kind of content regulator across both traditional broadcasting and social media broadcasting, I think, seemed to be a sort of a good way to go. But recognizing it would probably want to share expertise and maybe even investigations with the Information Commissioner and also with the Competition and Markets Authority. So I think that's where we came out, and then and giving the job principally then to our media regulator seemed more sensible than creating yet another new body. I suppose that's where we came out. So I'd be interested to see whether other European countries end up doing something similar, just because that's the easiest place to get started.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Although, of course, unfortunately, in the EU, there's also some countries where media freedom and the oversight over the role of government in the media landscape are much more controversial than in, let's say, the Netherlands and the UK. So I think it's important that the EU plays a role also in ensuring that there's respect for the rule of law, respect for fundamental rights, first and foremost, embedded in the way in which these rules are not only intended, but also enforced. And, whenever we touch freedom of expression, but also questions of, the ability to challenge a decision and questions of censorship, potentially when, platforms might be overambitious in taking down content, then it's so important that there's clarity of the rules that these decisions are based on. And I think that has been wholly missing when we saw so much agency and curating ability in the hands of essentially advertising platforms, right? And it's in some ways no surprise that if you optimize for profit and matching ads to people, that the outcome when it comes to the democratic debate and access to information and media pluralism is not optimal. It was never even the intention of how these platforms were built. And so what I'm hoping is that these rule of law principles, democratic principles, will be leading again in how the checks and balances and the oversight process is designed. And here, of course, who gets to say when content is harmful, which definitions are used, is vital. And it's also an opportunity in some ways to actually pinpoint where that process in the hands of some European governments at the moment is actually failing and unfortunately challenging the rule of law instead of strengthening it.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and you're right to say that we shouldn't just think of the EU as being a single block where all countries are broadly the same. That there are big differences in the types of styles of government and in the traditions of free media as well. I think that point you make though about defining, when we define disinformation and harmful content, what do we mean by it? Because there is a danger that we end up falling back on the definitions given by the media companies, the social media companies, of content that poses immediate and imminent physical harm. Now that obviously is incredibly serious, but where within that landscape do things like deep fake films created to undermine an election sit, and where I think we would expect to have some standards and rules enforced there too.
Oh, absolutely. And the urgency of that is becoming greater and greater with every day that passes. And I honestly think that this question of, trust and who puts information in context, not only allowing it to go viral by invoking the strongest emotions, but also challenging, for example, claims that are made or explaining the mechanisms. I saw a really interesting thread on Twitter. Obviously, we all use these platforms, but explained by Kate Starbird, a great academic that spent some time at Stanford as well. But she explained how, sometimes people who are interested in sharing disinformation or false claims are going back to, archives of medical and other academic research, placing it in a completely different context to, try to substantiate the point that they're making. For example, that that there's a overestimating of the risk of COVID, for example, and how hard it is to actually go back and reveal how this context, and putting, for example, an economic paper in a medical context, even if it came from a renowned university, can really mislead people. And I think journalism and having transparency about who is at the table. If you imagine an interview on television, you can see who is making a certain statement. You may have a good or rather gossipy journalist asking questions, which helps the viewer to understand what they're looking at, and to see, hopefully, that claims, whether they be by politicians or business people or doctors, are challenged and put in context. And that context is so often missing online, and it starts to create whole different kinds of incentives for people to share. Commercial incentives, I think, often overlooked. People who are cynically trying to simply make money on the backs of people who may be worried about COVID, who may be worried about their safety, or may be worried about immigration. And it's not only about whether there should be free speech or this being a marketplace of ideas or a public square online, but really people who are deliberately trying to steer people to more polarization and division, or towards lacing their own pockets. And it's really important to see that, and to create the kind of context and checks and balances also vis-a-vis the claims that we hear being made on the internet. And so I'm hoping that we will get back to some kind of context that can help people better understand what they're looking at, and not just fall into traps that are essentially placed for them, cynical that might be.
I'd just like to bring in Felix Kartte into the conversation at this point. I asked Marietje where she was joining us from. Where are you today, Felix?
I'm in Berlin, in my own apartment, not as spectacular as Maritje's whereabouts.
Now, you've been looking at these issues for a long time, both in your previous work at the European Commission and the European External Action Service, but and recently in work you've done analysing the impact of disinformation on people's attitudes towards COVID. Mm-hmm. I thought that's quite a good place to start in some ways, because I think COVID has really demonstrated the power of disinformation when you take something that's new that people didn't have fixed views on before, and yet their views are shaped and changed by what they see and read on social media. Mm-hmm. I mean, I was very interested in the work you did, Counteraction, studying the role of COVID disinformation.
I'm happy to talk about that. One thing I want to just reiterate, I know that both of you have made that point already, but that the draft DSA it's not content regulation. The idea is not, for very good reasons, to tell platforms what kind of content to take down, but it is indeed focused on due diligence, on process, telling them what standards they have to abide by in taking down whatever content, be it illegal or basically outlawed by their own terms of services. And for the reasons that Marietje also indicated, I think that's incredibly important. Among those due diligence standards and obligations that we will hopefully see enacted in law, is some not so far point in the future, is also data access for researchers, for fact checkers, for independent regulators. In my previous job at the External Action Service, I had the privilege to engage all kinds of groups and actors who work on these issues, who try to study, identify, and counter digital threats to democracy, be it researchers, be it national governments, be it fact checkers. And basically, the unanimous conclusion that I got from all of these groups over the few years that I was working on these issues was that the big platforms, the big companies were screwing them over, that they never delivered on meaningful data access, that the information they provided was basically just gaslighting attempts. And when we're dealing indeed with issues that are as evidently about the public interest as health-related disinformation in this pandemic, I don't think that's a sustainable approach to making public policy and to countering, mitigating this kind of threat to society. So I'm very excited actually that the draft DSA, I think for the first time, but defines the harms, the broader societal harms that the platform advertisement-driven business model poses to society, to democracy, and to public health as public policy concerns, and that they define very specific procedural provisions for how the companies have to tackle these threats and how they will be held accountable. Indeed, some of the analysis that I have recently conducted myself, but I've also been reviewing stuff that others have been doing, excellent researchers, much more experienced researchers than me, is that also around COVID disinfo, the big platforms, including Facebook, YouTube, don't have their act together. They are basically engaging in what I think some US researchers whose name I just forgot, unfortunately, but called transparency theater. They're creating with a lot of PR money the illusion of transparency and access, but they're not delivering at all. At the same time, we have seen that despite their revised terms of services, where Facebook, for instance, as you just mentioned, included health-related misinformation with potential to cause harm to health in their terms of services, that despite these policy changes, disinformation is festering all over the platform. We found thousands of pieces of content on public, that's important to emphasize, public Facebook groups, public Facebook pages. Basically blaming here, I did an analysis in Germany, it's a very sensitive issue here, blaming Jews for the virus, claiming that people should take zinc instead of vaccinating, all this kind of stuff that is so ridiculously easy to identify with the most basic machine learning tools. It was there, and it reached thousands, if not millions of people. And the funny thing is, by the way, I could claim whatever number. I could say that 50 million Germans engaged with this content, because nobody can falsify that claim, because Facebook does not provide the respective data access to anybody. I hope that answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, I think it absolutely did. And I think it raises one or two quite important questions as well, which is, as you say, no one really knows who's doing what on Facebook. I mean, the researchers can find things, and it always poses the question that if external researchers can find this stuff, why can't the company find it itself and be more effective at acting on it? And who knows really how effective they are? And for the Digital Services Act to really work, do you think there's going to need to be some sort of legal obligation placed on the social media companies that if researchers or institutions require access to be able to understand whether they're doing all they can to counter harmful COVID disinformation, for example, that they have to disclose that information to research bodies or other institutions? Because if then there's no requirement for them to do that, then the danger is that we'll never really know whether they're doing all they could.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And I'm almost, I could say, thrilled to see these proposals included in the draft DSA that was launched mid-December. There would be very specific data access requirements for the platforms, and they could end up being fined if they don't deliver and if they don't have basically meaningful explanations for failing to deliver that kind of data access. And it will no longer also, because I mean, Facebook had been running these flagship PR initiatives, social science one, a few others that were about providing and basically a safe space and a sandbox, some form of very high-level data access to researchers. It was always Facebook who defined the terms, what kind of data, under what conditions, to what kind of researchers. And this will no longer be the case if the DSA in its current form gets enacted. It will be the public side, public authority defining the conditions. And I think this would be a huge leap forward.
One of the issues we've discussed a lot over the last couple of years, and on this podcast as well, is the impact in Germany of the hate speech laws being applied to social media companies. I know that there's been a lot of debate around how effective this has been, and again, because we largely rely on self-declared information from the social media companies, it's difficult to know how effective it's been in terms of content moderation. But one of the things that companies like Facebook have stressed is that they've, as a consequence of the law being applied in the way it is applied, they've had to hire more people to moderate content in Germany. And do you think that is the case? And do you think, therefore, that when there are new obligations placed on the companies, they suddenly find the resources to try and meet those obligations?
Of course they have the resources. I think that's a ridiculous, if not cynical claim. I mean, they're the richest companies in the world. Of course, they can afford my content moderators, and they should also create humane working conditions for those moderators. One issue that I have, and I would like to see clarification myself, because I'm not immediately able to explain what it's about. But one issue I actually have relating to this with the DSA draft is the provision about trusted flaggers. I know that this is how Facebook has been working with fact checkers, with some researchers, especially around elections, for instance, to have give certain form of APIs, data access basically to those groups to flag dangerous, problematic, or illegal content to them. What I find so difficult about this is that it actually comes down to outsourcing the work of keeping their platform in order, keeping their house in order to others. I like the transparency aspect of it, but I do think that Facebook has all the funds and all the means to actually internalize that kind of work and to pay for it themselves.
I absolutely agree with that, and I think the NetzDG example of the German hate speech law shows that actually when they're made to do it, they do it. All of a sudden, they start hiring new fact checkers and content moderators, and because on the whole, they try to comply, even though we don't have full access to the data to know how effective they actually are.
That's exactly right.
Now, Charles, I'd like to bring you into the conversation at this point. Now, having asked the others where they are you still in Oslo with your family?
I am still in Oslo with my family, where lockdown has increased just a little bit this week as the country keeps trying to get better control over the coronavirus, but they seem to be doing a good job up here. It's really interesting, the point that Felix was just making about outsourcing, because this is what I've often thought about McDonald's, that if McDonald's was just post a hygiene crisis and they decided to start crowdsourcing their kitchen hygiene, the entire world would laugh at them and they'd be banged up into all kinds of regulations. So it's fascinating what the big social media companies are getting away with there. What I've been looking at this week, there are reports out over the holidays, Damian, that are showing that since the U.S. election, and this is a real surprise, there's actually been an increase in the amount of disinformation about the election. It's a surprise, but it's not really a mystery as to why, because there is this substantial challenge to the result of the election that's being mounted by both new and more entrenched Republicans. Tommy Tuberville is an example of that. He's the new senator and former football coach from Alabama. He's at one end of the spectrum. Then at the other end, you have establishment figures by Ted Cruz and the president himself. But what's interesting about this wave of disinformation over the holidays is that much of it is penetrating ethnic and immigrant communities, and often it's through non-traditional channels. Yes, Facebook, Twitter, etc., but also through more intimate platforms, or what I think of as intimate platforms like WhatsApp, WeChat, and Kakao Talk. Now, that that last one, if you haven't heard of it, it's often called Kartte, and it's a messaging platform with a huge Korean-speaking audience. As regular listeners know, private messaging platforms are also particularly hard to monitor precisely because they're private, and we can't easily see disinformation passing through channels there. So the platform operators themselves are also, or they claim to be, less able to monitor the content that they are in fact responsible for distributing. But what this is doing, it's creating spikes of QAnon level conspiracy theories being passed in marginal communities around the world. Now, this applies to ethnic communities in the US, which manifests itself in really interesting ways. For example, anti-communism has traditionally been part of the Republican appeal to older immigrants communities, and campaigning that paints Democrats as socialists reinforces that, but it works especially well among, say, for example, Korean, Chinese, Taiwanese, Vietnamese immigrant communities who are often sensitive about anything that veers anywhere close to the Chinese Communist Party. But this extreme level disinformation targeted at ethnic communities also applies in the rest of the world. And we see it here, particularly in Europe, in former Soviet states. And that goes from Serb enclaves in Kosovo to Russian-speaking communities in the Baltic. These are groups that lean toward Russian as a first language and feel alienated from Western media. They're simultaneously finding themselves flooded with Kremlin-driven Russian propaganda through both traditional broadcast channels like RT, but then also increasingly through these private messaging platforms. Now, there's a question about this. Is it all working? And I would say the answer is yes. Polls are showing right now that, for example, Asian Americans voted for Joe Biden by a smaller margin than they did for Hillary Clinton in 2016. There could be a lot of explanations for that, sure, but ethnically targeted disinformation campaigns could certainly be one. And groups also often use WhatsApp and WeChat and non-English speaking campaigns to smear protest groups like Black Lives Matters. And what they do is they warn about mass rioting on election days. This is as an example. But what that does is it deters Asian and Latino communities and immigrants from going out to vote. And my opinion is that anything that discourages voting is actually a long-term problem down both sides of the political aisle. So the question is, what's to be done about this? Now, I think that folks working in the interest of the civil society need to get surgical in their canvassing, and as surgical as the disinformation operators are. We need more trained bilingual operators reaching out to immigrant voters and communities via social media and in person. And that makes for both a long-term solution, but also a short-term strategy. And as we both know, Damian, getting the long-term and the short-term right is really hard to come by in this space.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Charles. It reminds me as well of something that came up during the Select Committee disinformation inquiry, where I think we had evidence of sort of Russian-trained units in Venezuela directing disinformation at Spanish voters in the Catalan independence referendum. And there was some question about whether similar sort of units in Venezuela were also targeting members of the Hispanic community in America as well.
Right, absolutely, and you get double your money there, and it's like Russian operations in Ghana that were revealed recently as well.
And I think I think rather like COVID as well, the American election, question of whether you dispute the result. We've seen changes over the months as well, whereby the number of particularly Republican voters who believe the election was stolen has increased since polling day.
It's extraordinary. I would love to be a fly on the wall in a Republican strategy meeting sometime.
Now, before we go, I wonder if I could just go back to Marietje and to Felix, and looking at the DSA and the DMA in Europe. You both understand the European institutions well and have spent many years working in them. How quickly do you think this process can move forward now?
Well, if I can start, this can take a couple of years before it's finalized, especially implemented. So I think we will see a lot of back and forth about the details, which will be crucial. We'll see unprecedented lobbying, as I mentioned. But I hope that the process will also help clarify a number of things. I think it's really remarkable to hear examples by the previous speakers about how the selective use of invoking privacy and also the GDPR has really been benefiting companies who do not want to see independent researchers or independent oversight. I mean, I've never seen as much focus on privacy from tech platforms as when it was about shielding their own information from the public interest and the scrutiny that it deserves. So I think the goals of the DSM and the DSA are clear. They're supposed to strengthen the public interest, strengthen independent oversight, transparency, and accountability, which I think is really great. It's also important not to see them as the only efforts to balance the outsized power of tech governance by private companies, but rather to see them in the context of other efforts, antitrust, democracy action plan, even cybersecurity efforts. And I think that's both important for context, especially for people who do not live in the Brussels bubble, but also a challenge for those in the EU institutions to make sure that between all those different efforts that are on the table now, an artificial intelligence legislation coming up as well, everything is still watertight, that there's not a sort of divide and conquer that could be played between different legislative efforts by lobbyists or overlooked areas where something is deemed to be covered but then unfortunately isn't, or when there's even friction between the different policy efforts. So I would say this is a great opportunity to get to know more about how the democratic process works in the EU. It's complicated, but hopefully the proposals will be strengthened and will gather broad support.
Thank you. And Felix?
Yeah, I agree with Marietje that it's most likely going to take a long while. There will be unprecedented lobbying. It has in fact already begun, as we have also read in some news coverage on the part of the big platforms. They have all the reasons to be wary of this initiative and to try to stop it, if we consider that it would be the first time that they really have to systematically disclose, not just to regulators, but to the public and to their shareholders, the degree to which manipulation and disinformation and illegal content, in fact, permeates their platforms, their services. And I don't think their shareholders would be happy. So I completely understand that they're making every effort to water down this initiative. While it will take time, I really hope that the DSA discussion will provide us as civil society actors with a backdrop against which to request more voluntary measures, more data access before the piece ever enters into law. I'm thinking, for instance, now of the German elections. There are going to be elections in the Netherlands soon, I think in March already. But
March 17th.
So this soon. This could, of course, I mean, it's maybe a bit late in the Netherlands, but I'm sure there are great civil society projects ongoing there as well already. But this could, of course, be like the TSA discussion, great inspiration for the platforms to become a little bit more cooperative and transparent already. I just wanted to add one last, very, very short anecdote, because Charles just talked about foreign operations on the platforms. And even at the height of the European elections, where I was still part of the counter disinformation team at the European External Action Service, where we try to analyze and counter especially Russian and Chinese operations targeting EU audiences on social media. Any insight we got ultimately from the platforms we had from their PR blogs, when they chose to share information with us, not even data, after consulting it basically with 3 US-based think tanks. And I think this was, representing a public institution charged with overseeing the integrity of the electoral process. This was almost a humiliating, but at least a deeply frustrating experience. And once again, I'm very happy that the DSA is looking to change that.
That's great. And Marietje, Felix, Charles, thank you so much for joining me for this Infotagion podcast.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Marietje Schaake, Felix Kartte, and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all proceeds will go towards the making of this show. Thank you. Until next time.